Hello.
It was my final semester before graduation, and I was already half checked out. I'd done my time, papers, exams, late nights, part-time jobs. I wasn't a straight-A student, but I had this one thing that kept me grounded: writing. Not just essays or reports. I liked how words could cut, heal, or wrap around a moment like a bandage. I never told anyone that, not even my friends. The Monday after winter break, I walked into my literature class expecting Mr. Lawson, our tenured professor with his worn-out corduroy jackets and monotone lectures. Instead, there was someone else, a woman, younger than I expected, standing by the desk with a stack of books in her arms and an expression that didn't quite match her age. She was dressed simply: dark jeans, a long gray cardigan, but she had a presence that quieted the room instantly. She introduced herself as Ms. Carter. She was filling in for Mr. Lawson for the semester while he was on sabbatical. That was all she said, and that was all it took. There was something about the way she looked at the class, calm but alert, like she was watching all of us and none of us at once. I don't know why, but I sat up straighter than usual that day. Over the next few weeks, things changed in that classroom. She didn't lecture, she engaged, asked questions that made you uncomfortable in the best way, pushed us to read between the lines, not just in novels but in ourselves. Most students appreciated her passion, though a few rolled their eyes when she asked us to journal after every class. I didn't. I liked it. We were assigned a personal essay. Tell me the truth you're most afraid of saying out loud. That was the prompt. It hit me harder than I expected. I stayed up late that night, typing with my headphones in and my heart thudding with every sentence. I wrote about feeling invisible, about how I'd never told anyone that I wanted to be a writer because I was afraid that if I failed, no one would care. I turned it in the next day and avoided looking at her as I dropped it on her desk. 2 days later, she returned the papers. Most had quick red markings, a couple of comments. Mine had none. Just one handwritten note at the bottom. "Can you stay after class tomorrow? Miss Carter." My stomach dropped. I didn't know whether to be nervous or proud. That next day, I stayed behind as the rest of the students shuffled out, their backpacks squeaking and zippers buzzing. She stood at the window, flipping through a worn copy of the Bell Jar. She didn't look up until the room was quiet. "Thanks for waiting," she said softly. Then she walked over to the door, reached out, and locked it. There was a pause, not threatening, just deliberate. She sat on the edge of her desk and crossed her arms. "You don't write like someone who wants to be invisible," she said. I wasn't sure what to say. My voice caught somewhere in my throat. She didn't press, just waited. "I didn't think anyone would read it that closely," I finally mumbled. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing gently. "I always read closely." And then, for a brief second, we just sat there, the silence between us more personal than anything I'd felt in months. There were no lines being crossed. Not yet, but the air shifted, just enough for me to notice. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept thinking about her voice, the way she said my name when she handed back my paper. I wasn't sure what any of it meant, but something had started. Something I wasn't ready for, but couldn't walk away from either. The next few days blurred by like a slow-motion replay I couldn't stop watching in my head. That moment, her locking the door, sitting on the desk, saying she always reads closely, looped in my thoughts during lunch breaks, bus rides, even while brushing my teeth. It wasn't even about anything inappropriate. Not yet. It was something deeper. She had seen me, not the surface-level version everyone else dealt with. She saw something I hadn't shown anyone. I didn't tell a soul. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew no one would get it. The next time I walked into her class, something had shifted. She didn't call on me more than usual. She didn't look at me for longer than she should have. But it felt like we had a quiet understanding now, like something had passed between us, like we'd shared a secret no one else could see. That Thursday, class ended early. Everyone gathered their things. Some students joked around, asking if they could skip the next essay. She smiled politely but didn't engage. I had already stood up, about to head out when she called my name. Not loudly, not formally. Just like someone calling to a friend. "Do you have a few minutes?" she asked. I nodded without thinking. The last student walked out, and I heard the soft click of the door as it closed behind him. She didn't lock it this time. Instead, she sat on the windowsill, arms crossed loosely, sunlight spilling across her lap. She motioned to a chair nearby. I pulled it out and sat. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. "I liked what you wrote," she said, her voice softer than I'd heard it in class. Not just because it was honest, but because it wasn't polished. It was messy, real. You let the cracks show. I smiled faintly. "I figured that's what you were asking for." "I was," she said. "But most students write what they think I want to hear. You didn't. That's brave." I felt my ears flush a little. No one had ever called me brave. She leaned forward, resting her arms on her knees. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." "When did you start writing like that? With that much emotion?" I shrugged. "I think maybe when things started feeling too heavy to carry. Writing made it easier." Her gaze softened, and for the first time, she looked less like a teacher and more like a woman trying to understand someone. "I used to write like that too," she said. "Years ago, before I got lost in other things." "Why'd you stop?" I asked, genuinely curious. She looked out the window. "Because I stopped believing people wanted to hear the truth." There was a long silence. "You don't talk like a student," she said finally. "You listen too well." "You don't talk like a teacher," I replied before I could stop myself. "You make things feel different." She smiled at that. Not a wide smile, just enough to register something unspoken between us. The room felt quieter than usual. The hum of the air vent, the ticking clock, it all seemed to fade. For the first time, I noticed how her cardigan was slightly slipping from her shoulder, how the sun lit up the gold flecks in her eyes. She looked at me then, not as a student, not as a teacher, but just me. And that scared me. "I should go," I said, my voice breaking the stillness. She nodded slowly. "Okay." I stood up but didn't move for a second. I could feel her watching me. "Thanks," I said, not really sure for what. She didn't answer, just looked at me for a moment longer. That night, around 11:45 p.m., I got an email from her school address. Short, just a few words. "Your writing matters. Keep going. EC." I stared at the screen for a long time. No one else signed their emails with initials. After that night, everything changed. Though if you asked me exactly what changed, I couldn't have told you. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. A glance held a little longer. A smile that lingered just a few seconds more than it should. She wasn't acting different exactly, but I noticed the way she stopped calling on others as often, and how her questions seemed to be directed more at me, even when she didn't say my name. I began to show up early to class, sometimes just to sit there in silence, pretending to scroll through my phone while she organized papers or adjusted the blinds. She didn't tell me to leave. She never had to say anything. We just let the silence speak. She didn't mention the email. Neither did I. The next essay prompt she gave us was, "Describe a moment that changed the way you saw someone." I didn't hesitate. I wrote about her. Of course, I didn't use her name. I was careful. I wrapped it in metaphor. Sunlight through curtains, shadows on the floor, the silence between two people saying more than words. I turned her into fiction, but every word was real. When I handed it in, she looked up at me just for a second. I didn't know if she'd already read it or if she just knew. 2 days later, she stopped me after class again. "Got a minute?" she asked. This time, she didn't bother waiting for the others to leave. She said it right in front of them, like it was nothing. I waited until the room cleared, then leaned against one of the desks. She stood near the whiteboard, arms crossed, holding my essay like it was something fragile. "You wrote about me," she said. Not accusing, just honest. "I wrote about what I saw," I replied. "And what did you see?" Her tone was unreadable. "I saw someone who was hurting," I said, but still trying to help others feel less alone. That caught her off guard. I could tell. She looked away for a moment, as if steadying herself. Then, almost in a whisper, "Do you ever feel like you're too young to carry the weight you're carrying?" I didn't answer right away, because I did, all the time. But hearing her say it, someone like her, someone who seemed so composed, made it feel less like a weakness and more like a shared truth. She walked over and sat on the desk nearest me, close but not too close. "I was married," she said suddenly. "It ended last year." Quietly. No drama, just silence. I stopped writing, stopped talking to friends. Took this job to get away from the noise in my own head. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't say anything. "I don't usually talk about this," she added. "I don't usually write about mine," I said. "But I did. For you." She looked up. "Why?" "Because I knew you'd understand." There it was again, that silence. Thick, electric. She reached out and gently placed her hand on mine. Nothing suggestive, just human, real. I looked at our hands, then at her. Neither of us moved. Her voice dropped. "I'm not sure what this is." "Me neither," I admitted. "But I'm not pretending it's nothing." She gave the faintest smile, tired, warm. "I'm not pretending either." And then she stood up and quietly said, "Don't go just yet." I stayed. That day we didn't kiss. We didn't even touch again. But we both knew that whatever line there once was, it had shifted. Neither of us had crossed it, not fully, but we were walking it. Together. That night she didn't email me. Instead, she left a folded note inside the book I'd borrowed from her last week. I found it just before bed. "Meet me after class on Monday. No one will be there. Let's just talk." Monday came too slowly and too fast. I don't remember much of my other classes that day. I walked through them like a ghost, my mind stuck in loop. I kept thinking about her note, about the way her hand felt on mine, about how she looked at me, like she wanted to say more, but didn't know how. By the time her class came, my pulse was a steady drum in my chest. I sat through the lecture barely hearing a word. I watched her instead. She didn't glance my way once. It was as if nothing had happened. But I knew she felt it too. When the bell rang, students filtered out, chatting and packing up loudly. I stayed in my seat. She stood by the window watching the quad outside, hands clasped behind her back. Eventually, we were alone. She turned, walked slowly to the door, and locked it. The soft metallic click sounded louder than it should have. Then she turned to me, and the way she looked wasn't the way a teacher looks at a student. It wasn't even the way someone looks at a crush. It was how someone looks at someone they trust, even when they shouldn't. "I don't know what I'm doing," she said. "I don't either," I replied. "But I keep thinking about you," she continued. "I shouldn't say that. I know I shouldn't. But it's the truth." I stood up and moved a step closer. "I think about you too," I said. "More than I should." She sat down at her desk, hands trembling slightly, and pulled open the bottom drawer. From it, she took a small, dog-eared notebook, worn at the corners, full of colored sticky tabs. She held it out to me. "My writing," she said, "from before." I took it carefully, almost afraid to open it. "I haven't let anyone read this in years," she added. I flipped through the first few pages, slow and quiet. Her words were raw, lonely, beautiful, honest in a way that echoed mine. "Why did you stop?" I asked again. "Because no one made me feel like it mattered," she said. "Not until you." She stood again. We were closer now, inches apart. The silence returned, full of tension, but it wasn't awkward anymore. It was electric, warm. Her eyes flicked to my lips, then back up. And then, finally, we kissed. It wasn't rushed or clumsy. It was slow, soft, hesitant at first, like we were both afraid the other would pull away. But neither of us did. She rested her forehead against mine. "We crossed a line," she whispered. "I know, but it doesn't feel wrong." "No," I said, "it doesn't." That afternoon turned into a pattern. We stayed late, talked, shared pieces of ourselves. Some days it was just conversation. Some days it was more. But it was never careless. It always felt like something we were holding carefully between us, afraid it might break. She told me about her divorce, about how he made her feel small, invisible, how she took this job to start over, not expecting to find someone who saw her again. I told her things I'd never told anyone. About my mom leaving when I was 12, about my dad burying himself in work, about how I always felt like a backup character in my own story. She said I was anything but. One rainy Thursday, we stayed so late that the lights in the hallway had already turned off. The building was nearly empty. We sat on the couch in the corner of her office, wrapped in the quiet hum of the storm outside. She looked at me and said, "If I were your age, if things were different." "But they're not," I said. "This is what we have." She nodded, eyes glossy. "I just don't want to hurt you." "You're not," I said. "You're the first person who's ever really seen me." And just like that, we kissed again, longer this time, slower. Not desperate, just real. But in the back of both our minds, we knew we were walking a tightrope. Every touch, every word, every second we lingered past the bell, it was all a risk. And eventually, someone was going to notice. Couldn't last forever. Deep down, I think we both knew that. What we had was fragile, held together by quiet understanding and unspoken fears. But the world outside her classroom door didn't care about feelings. Cared about rules, lines, appearances. We weren't careful enough. It happened on a Wednesday. A substitute covered her first period, and the rumor mill ignited before lunchtime. Someone had seen us, not in the act, nothing obvious, but the way she touched my shoulder once after class, the way I stayed behind too often, the way we both smiled when no one else was looking. Kids talk, teachers listen, and someone decided to say something. That afternoon, I walked into her classroom and immediately sensed it. The tension in the air, the tightness in her jaw. Her hands trembled slightly as she rearranged her notes. "We need to talk," she said. The way she said it made my stomach drop. I shut the door, but she didn't lock it this time. "There was an email this morning," she said. "Anonymous tip. They're opening a review." I sat down slowly. A review. They're calling it a professional conduct inquiry. I'll be on leave starting tomorrow. I stared at her, trying to process. "We didn't even." "I know," she interrupted gently. "I know we didn't go too far, but sometimes perception is enough." Her voice cracked on that last word. She looked away, blinking fast. I felt something in me collapse. Not just because we might get caught, but because what we had was real, and it was already slipping through our fingers. "What do we do?" I asked. She shook her head slowly. "I think we already did it." She stood, walked over, and placed her hand on my shoulder. A small gesture, safe, but it held everything we couldn't say aloud. "I don't regret it," I whispered. "Neither do I," she said. The next day she was gone. A new teacher sat at her desk. No explanations, just a brief mention that Miss Collins was on leave for personal matters. Her desk stayed untouched for days. A week later, I found a sealed envelope tucked inside the front cover of my old essay notebook. No name, just my initials on the corner. I opened it at home that night. Inside was a handwritten note. "Maybe one day we'll meet again, not as student and teacher, but as two people who understand each other. Until then, keep writing. You saved me in ways you'll never understand." I never saw her again. I still don't know who sent the anonymous tip. Maybe it doesn't matter. What matters is this. She taught me more than writing. She taught me what it meant to be seen, to be heard, to matter. And sometimes, that's the kind of lesson that stays with you for the rest of your life.
Bye bye.